Welcome back, everyone. Today I have a fun project for the springtime. We're going to be making fabric plant pots. And this is a super easy project for all skill levels. And we're also going to be testing a few different fabrics and a few different ways to actually make this plant pot. With all that being said, this is a free printable pattern. There's no sign up necessary. All you have to do is click the link, download the pattern, print it off, and you're ready to go. And once you've done that, let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're going to want to grab 1 to 2 yards for your main fabric. This depends on the size and also how many you plan on making. And as far as the fabric goes, I recommend using a canvas, a non-woven, or even a heavy-duty mesh material. And I'm going to be testing a few different fabrics. We're going to be testing upholstery fabric, canvas, non-woven, and a really heavy-duty mesh. So if you want to decide which one to use, just go ahead and skip ahead to see what bag you like the best. But like always, definitely feel free to test out fabrics and comment down below. You'll need 1 to 2 yards of 1-inch webbing, and this again depends on how many bags you plan to make. I'm using a heavy duty 1-inch webbing. I found this size works really nice with the bag and just works great for the handles, but you can go wider if you want, so just keep that in mind when you're buying webbing. Lastly, you'll need your pattern, and this is a free pattern, no sign up necessary. All you have to do is click the link, download the pattern, print it off, and you're ready to go. The pattern also comes in multiple sizes, ranging from 1 gallon to 7 gallon. And after printing out your pattern, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after you gather your supplies, print off your pattern, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like the pattern on the screen. This pattern also comes in 5 different sizes, ranging from 1 gallon to 7 gallon. Using the pattern key, you can see that each size has a different color with the measurements. So pick the size you want to get started with and cut on the outside of the line. After cutting, you should end up with 1 side panel cut on the fold out of your main fabric, 1 bottom panel on the fold out of your main fabric. We'll be starting with the first sewing technique using the non-woven fabric. If you'd like to see the second technique, go ahead and skip to 7 minutes and 32 seconds, where we'll be using the canvas and other materials. So getting started with construction, we're going to first mark our webbing placement. With the panel folded in half, we're going to lay our pattern over the panel and trace the placement areas with chalk on both sides. I like to mark the top and the bottom and use a ruler to connect the points. Grab your webbing to make sure it fits in the area correctly, and from here we're going to determine how long we want the straps. This is totally up to you and how you want the handles to look and feel. I like to cut mine a little bit longer so I have more handle to work with. I cut mine about 2 feet for the biggest size. And also keep in mind you're going to want to leave a little room at the bottom so the webbing goes past the bottom edge. But before cutting your webbing, definitely play around with it, move the strap up and down and see where you want the strap to lay. Once you're satisfied with the size, we're going to pin it down in our placement guide areas, flip it to the opposite side, and do the same thing. With both sides pinned down and perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch as close as we can to the outside edge of that strap, going up, across, and back down. And when it comes to sewing the top stitch, you can also stop or start that wherever you want. If you leave less, it's going to make for a longer handle. I like to take my stitch up pretty close to the top, right up before that handle starts to curve over to the opposite side. Doing this gives me a less floppy handle. Another really big tip is using thread that matches the color of your webbing. This will hide any imperfections and make it look perfectly solid on your strap. The next step is a bonus step. We're going to be adding a few tack stitches right at that top, going back and forth quite a few times to really secure it to our fabric. This is mainly for the bigger sizes because the bigger sizes will be holding more dirt, so that little bit of extra strength really comes in handy. And you don't have to do just 3 bars. You can either do a box stitch, a box and an X, or an X. It's totally up to you and what you think is the strongest stitch. Next, we're going to fold the panel in half with right sides together and stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, pull the right sides out and place that side seam in the center of the panel. And what we're going to do is pinch just below the seam and fold it to the left or the right. If done correctly, the whole seam should take about 2 inches. I highly recommend pinning to keep that side seam even, and once you have it pinned down, we're going to stitch directly on that edge. Feel free to use an edge presser foot or any other tools that help you get a nice straight stitch. And this is totally optional. I'm adding 1 more stitch from the inside on the inside edge. This will give it a touch more strength and really help hide that raw edge on the inside of the bag. And once you completed 1 or 2 stitches, we're going to flip the wrong sides back out, grab our bottom panel, stand the complete side panel up on its edge so the bottom is facing up, and we're going to place the right sides together, lining the bottom edge of our side panel up with the bottom panel. And when you have it perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The biggest key to get that perfectly aligned edge with the bottom panel is to really make sure you did the last step correctly and get the correct seam allowance in that side seam. And after completing the stitch, we're going to flip the right sides back out, and from here we're going to add a top stitch to that inside bottom edge. Fold the seam allowance towards the bottom panel and add a top stitch. If that sounds confusing, all you have to do is fold that seam allowance so it's touching the bottom panel and then stitch directly on that bottom panel. I'm using an edge presser foot like I did on the webbing, so this keeps me a nice consistent straight stitch all the way around that bottom edge. And again, this is an optional step, so feel free to skip ahead. Next, we're going to grab the pattern and mark out the top hem on the top edge of our side panel. And once you have it marked, we're going to roll that edge over one time and pin it into position. And I like using pins when it comes to hemming top edges like this. That edge is at the top of the bag and it's really noticeable when it's all wonky, so using the pins allows you to get a nice, perfect, clean edge. I'm also sewing from the inside of the bag. This allows me to keep right on the edge and use my edge presser foot. If you do this method, I recommend changing your bobbin thread to match your fabric color. After stitching, pop the bag open, double check all the seams, make sure the webbing is sewn down, everything's looking good, and that's going to complete the first method for this bag. Moving on to the second method, we're going to start by grabbing our upholstery fabric. This is the fabric we're going to be sewing with, but you can also use a nice heavyweight canvas. I found that the heavyweight canvas makes for a very, very high-end quality bag. Or you can use a heavyweight mesh. The mesh I'm using is very dense, so that way the dirt does not fall out the holes. And all of these fabrics make for a great bag, so pick whatever fabric you want and start by cutting out the side panel. And we'll be cutting it on the fold out of the fabric of your choice. Cut one bottom panel on the fold out of the fabric of your choice. Moving on to construction, we're going to grab the pattern, lay it on our folded panel, and mark out our webbing placement. And repeat this for the opposite side of our panel. Cut 2 webbing straps, and this is going to be based on the size you're making and also the size of the handle you want to make. You can make these longer or shorter. I'm cutting mine at 2 feet for the largest size. Place the webbing on the placement guides, make sure it goes over the bottom edge just about 1/4 of an inch. And if you didn't already cut your webbing, you can move it up and down to kind of play around with it to see how high you want your handles to be. I'm keeping mine fairly short and tight so they're not flopping around. Once you have one side pinned down, we're going to flip it to the opposite side and pin the opposite side down. Make sure you keep these perfectly lined up with one another. It's also key to have the same length webbing so the handles line up and they're even. And with the webbing pinned down, we're going to stitch the outside edge as close as we can to the edge. I like to start at the bottom, stitch towards the top, stitch across, and then stitch back down. Go ahead and repeat this process for all of your webbing ends. Another quick tip is to use an edge presser foot to get a nice straight stitch along that edge. And since we are making the largest size bag, we're going to add a few bar tack stitches along that top edge just to make sure it can hold a lot of weight. This step is optional depending on what size bag you're making. Also, feel free to mix it up and do a box stitch, an X stitch, or an X in a box. Moving on, we're going to fold the panel in half with the right sides together, lining up the side edge. With the side edge perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch out a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is where we start changing up the construction technique. Instead of folding that side and adding a top stitch, we're actually going to add bias tape to that inside edge. And I'm going to run you through a few different methods. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags, but feel free to use whatever method that works best for you. And after adding the bias tape, we're going to fold the panel flat with the side seam in the center of the panel, and fold the bias tape seam allowance to the left or the right. The best way to stitch it is by flipping the right side out, folding the seam allowance to the left or right, adding a few pins, and then stitching. I like to stitch as close as I can to that seam and then add one more stitch a 1/4 inch away from that stitch. The second stitch is optional, but it will add a little extra support. Next, we're going to flip it inside out and grab our bottom panel. We're going to line that bottom panel up with the bottom edge of that side panel with the right sides together, pin it into position, and stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you did your side seam correctly on the side panel, it's going to match up perfectly with the bottom panel, and you'll be able to stitch all the way right through without making any adjustments. And after stitching, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together. And from here, you have a few different options. You can add a top stitch, or you can add bias tape to that raw edge. After adding the bias tape, flip the right side out and we're going to add our top hem. Again, we have a few different options to make this hem. We can fold it and stitch it like we did in the previous construction set, or we can do the easier method and add bias tape to that raw edge. And feel free to do whatever technique that you want and works best for your fabric. This fabric frays a lot, so I like to cover up those raw edges. And I kind of combine the two sewing techniques for the mesh fabric, so you don't totally have to follow it exactly, kind of mix and match and do what works best for you. And there you have it, your fabric bag is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully all your bags turned out awesome. And if you used any crazy fabrics, definitely comment down below, tell me what you used. I'd love to know so we can pass that information on to other people making this bag. I will say I think the mesh one is gonna work out the best. It has the most airflow to the roots, but we'll definitely see as time goes on. Like always, if you ever have any questions, comment down below or send me a message on my website. And I would love to hear what everyone wants me to make. So also comment that down below too. But like always, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.